Manna is very much a mercy and justice ministry, but it's a mercy and justice ministry to the church. So our intent is not to really directly sow into the community. We sow into the church. We believe the church is the vehicle. Christ established the church, and so we're all about sowing into the church and then seeing the church sow into the community. And so, as a mercy and justice ministry, we felt like, I think we've got the mercy theme down pretty well, like caring and concern for the church, the local church. But what does it mean to have justice? What does it mean to be just? And I think within the church, oftentimes we don't want to talk about that. Justice is a hot button topic culturally, but I think even the last few years have exposed within the church that it's a hot button issue too.
Hello, my friends. Welcome to the Christ and Coffee podcast. My name is Dr. Haig, and if you're tuning in, you must be all about uniting Christians one coffee hour conversation at a time. Today, we have someone who's all about church unity in Southern California, James Gann. He is the founder and director of Manna SoCal. Manna's mission is to support church planters and pastors in Southern California by providing resources, building partnerships, and cultivating sustainable churches. As a pastor in Southern California myself, I have benefited tremendously from this ministry through their workshops and conferences that specifically help church leaders. Today, we hear about how this wonderful ministry started in 2018. We learn about James Gann's family testimony. We learn about his specific call into the ministry and how God used his failed church plant to pivot into this wonderful ministry that helps countless churches and ministries in Southern California. To learn more about Manna, visit their website, mannasolcal.com. But before we jump in today's conversation, let us read our verse of the week, which comes from 2 Corinthians chapter 9, verses 6 to 7. Remember this, whoever sows sparingly will also reap sparingly, and whoever sows generously will also reap generously. Each of you should give what you have decided in your heart to give, not reluctantly or under compulsion, for God loves a cheerful giver. With that said, please grab a cup of coffee and enjoy this Christ-centered conversation. Hey, James, welcome to the Christ and Coffee podcast. How are you doing, my friend?
Oh, I'm doing great. Thanks for having me.
Of course. First question, as I ask all our guests, how do you drink your coffee?
Yeah, so your viewers might hate me for this, but I actually don't drink coffee.
You're not the first guest to not drink coffee.
Okay.
But you've been the first guest in a while that doesn't drink coffee.
Okay.
Was this a cultural thing, theological thing, personal thing?
I'm
not offended. I forgive you.
Well, my wife loves coffee.
Okay, that's good.
She's the coffee connoisseur. Just never developed a taste for it.
Okay.
And even through college, when I was in architecture school, pulled so many all-nighters, still never got on the caffeine bandwagon for whatever reason.
Do you ban all caffeine, or you still have caffeinated teas and drinks, or?
I'll have a cherry Coke from time to time. That's kind of my one of my guilty pleasures.
Okay.
Here and there. I'll have tea sometimes, and now I'm having hot chocolate, which has a little bit of caffeine.
Yeah.
And me, like I was saying, me and my oldest daughter, we enjoy hot chocolate.
Yeah, of course, it's a go-to. One thing I miss about New York after living in California, it's hot chocolate with the snow is something special.
Yep.
And when it's just like a little bit colder, it doesn't have the same feels to it, but it does taste like the holidays, hot chocolate specifically. It's always fun to make. That's great to hear your daughter makes it for you. That's awesome.
Yeah.
What was it like growing up for you though? Did you make hot chocolate for your parents? What was your upbringing like?
Yeah, so I grew up in Missouri, Midwest. I actually was born in California, but grew up in Missouri, and we had a lot of hot chocolate. Winters there can be cold. We get all 4 seasons there, which is nice. Beautiful during the fall, cold during the winter, hot and humid during the summer.
Yeah.
But yeah, definitely would have some hot chocolates. I remember the winters there was this big hill near our house at the local park, and we would go sledding every year. That was like the big thing we always look forward to. And it had like a big dip at the bottom, and so you would go down it, fly up, and have to hang on to your board, or else you'd go flying off and not break your back, but come pretty close.
Yeah,
So,
yeah.
yeah, growing up, winters, those were some of the things we really look forward to.
Did you grow up in a Christian home?
Um, sort of. So,
I feel like that's most people. It's like
yeah,
sort of, yeah.
yeah, yeah. It's interesting. My parents have an interesting story. My dad was in the Navy. He got out right before I was born. But he was a typical sailor, and did things that sailors do. He wasn't a Christian. My mom was a Catholic background. My dad really didn't have a background when it came to religion. But my mom came to Christ at some point, and she married my dad. And the realization that your spouse is not where you're at, and she just continued to pray for him and believe. And there's actually some prophecy over him that he would get saved eventually. But literally, she held on there for a good number of years, because my dad was an alcoholic.
Wow.
He did drugs. He was abusive to my mom, but she was faithful, and it was just incredible how she really took up the headship of our household, prayed over me, my brother, my dad. So he eventually came to the faith when I was 5.
Oh, wow.
And it really dramatically changed. It was a radical salvation for him.
Okay, and the behavior followed. It wasn't
Oh yeah,
just
I was
I
just
just
like,
believe. It's just
he just stopped drinking, stopped drugs. I mean, all at once. It was a radical salvation. And even though my mom was a believer, but when that happened, it really changed our household pretty dramatically. And of course, my brother and I were grateful for it, because we saw the difference in my dad, and how he treated my mom, and how he treated us. And
wow. As a 5-year-old, you could see that like night and day. Yeah.
yeah, I mean, I
course,
remember.
yeah.
I can remember the before. I can remember him. Man, he worked at Pepsi Cola. When he was in the Navy, he worked on a sub on the machinery, and so he was working at Pepsi at the time on the machinery, and it was in Kansas City, which was about an hour drive. And yeah, one time he got into a huge accident before he was saved. Should have died. I mean, flipped over multiple times. I don't know if he was drinking or if he fell asleep at the wheel, but those types of things, like vividly, I can remember with my parents growing up. Just pretty incredible testimony that they had
Yeah. Well,
of what God brought them out of.
real testament to your mother's faithfulness, and
Yeah.
that's amazing. And so, did you have a personal conversion right after that, or or was it just like, okay, this thing changed my dad, our family's now changed? What about you personally?
I think for me, it was more of a process.
Yeah.
There's not a date I can point back to and say, like,
Yeah, of course.
I got baptized when I was 8. And I think one of the great things about growing up in a Christian household post my dad's salvation was that, we were around just great friends. We had great friends in the church, and that really helped me, especially like as a teenager growing up, and just kind of staying on the straight and narrow. And so having that encouragement. But yeah, I saw my friends getting baptized, and I think at the time it was something that I understood I needed to do.
Yeah.
I think my kind of wiring was, my motivation didn't come from the joy of Christ, as it came so much from the wanting to avoid hell as a youngster. And so I really had this kind of sense and need of not wanting to be disapproved of, and wanting to do the right thing, and wanting to go to heaven, not wanting to go to hell. So for me, I think it really started there. But it's interesting how God even will take that, even if maybe our motivations aren't fully pure, but he just continues to work with us and through us. And I think as I grew up, eventually went to college, faith became more real to me as I lived out on my own. And I definitely think once I moved out here to California, living on my own and um, ministering, really through ministry. But yeah, faith definitely becomes more real as you
Of
put it
course.
into practice. So it's been a process.
That's great. Yeah, I think that's the best way to describe it because I think sometimes in the evangelical world we get caught up with the moment and the date, and reality it's more likely you didn't have that road of Damascus experience, but more like the Apostle Peter,
Yeah.
getting it, not getting it, getting it, not getting it, and that's every Christian. And that's great that you frame it that way because it's really pure. And then you went to architect school for your schooling.
Yep. Yeah. I graduated with my bachelor's in architecture, University of Kansas. If there's any Jayhawk fans.
Please let us know if you're a Jayhawks fan in the comment section. Yeah,
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 do it. Yeah, went to Kansas, graduated. It's interesting. I mean, architecture school was one of the hardest things I've ever had to do. If anybody's familiar with
if
architecture
you just
school,
drank coffee, you would have been fine.
yeah, I probably would have enjoyed it more.
Yeah, yeah,
Um, but yeah, I mean, you're expected to do these, just tremendous projects, and they have something called studio. It's actually a class, and that's kind of your main learning space environment. And in studio, you have your own desk, and you would have projects throughout the year. You would need to use your desk to build things, build models, do drawings. Eventually, with CAD and all that kind of stuff that came on, use computers to do that kind of stuff. But I mean, the requirements that were put on you for that. I mean, there was a reason why they called Marvin Hall, which was the building where architecture school was in, the building that never sleeps. It's because the lights never went out, and all nighters were often.
yeah.
I remember in particular. My parents lived about an hour and a half away from the campus, and so going home for Thanksgiving one year after I just pulled an all-nighter to try to get stuff done
Right.
because I knew I was going to go home and spend some time away, and I hadn't slept, and so I'm driving home an hour and a half, and scary drive. I wouldn't recommend that to anybody, but yeah, I mean that was pretty typical in architecture school, just pulling all-nighters and not getting enough sleep and trying to get projects done.
It's crazy how like I used to pull all nighters for school and I cannot do it. I'm
Yeah.
just like I'm going to sleep. I'll just wake up a little bit earlier, and yeah, it just I don't know what the age is where all nighters become almost impossible to pull off.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yep.
yeah. So okay, you go to architect school, you graduate, and then you move out west for architect job or ministry or
Yep. Yeah. No, I moved out here for architecture. Yeah. I mean, I was, going to set the world on fire with my architecture skills,
yeah.
with my design skills, and Southern California was a place to be. So my brother actually was already out here. He was also an architecture major, believe it or not.
Wow.
And so I kind of followed him out here, like I followed him to architecture school. But he was out here for college. He was going to Biola, and then he also worked at a firm. And so he really pitched it to me like, hey, you got to come out here. Southern California is amazing.
Yeah.
You got to come out, live in downtown LA with me. And I live in an artist loft and all this kind of cool, when you're in architecture school, like just kind of the artsy thing, like you really enjoy that. So sounded great. I came out here during spring break before I graduated, had a job all lined up, and didn't really look into my brother's claim of like, artist loft and what all that meant. So came out here, lived in downtown LA, and honestly, it was cool at the time. I was 23, obviously no family, kids or anything. Really enjoyed it, but I'm sure I'll come to this story more later. But as I started getting connected with the church that we were part of at the time, the Dream Center, we did a lot of ministry to downtown, Skid Row areas, and just homeless shelters. And what I began to realize was that the place where I was living, that my brother had kind of hyped up as the artist loft, was actually no different than the homeless shelters that we were going to minister to. And so my brother had kind of pumped it up as like, hey, come out to Southern California, do the artist loft thing. It's just so cool and fun. And I realized like I'm living in a hotel. Like I'm actually living in a hotel. No wonder why it's so cheap out here, because we were only spending like $600 a month, and we had communal restrooms that we all shared on the same floor. So I just began to realize like the Southern California thing was a little different than what my brother had said. Um, but yeah, came out here to do architecture. Had some an architecture job lined up, and pretty soon after I moved out here, the job fell through. And just it was the economy at the time. It was kind of a downturn, and so here I am out in California. I only have my brother who doesn't have two nickels, and no money. Like I said, we're going to the Dream Center, so we would pick up somehow food passes to eat there because we couldn't afford much food, or we would eat egg salad sandwiches. And through the course of that, of not having a job, I started volunteering quite a bit at the church, and started going down to Skid Row and going down to the homeless shelters, and would go to the Huntington Hotel every weekend, and minister to the people there and just love on them and build a relationship with them. And I think, as you were even asking me earlier about my journey of faith, like that was when faith started to become real to me. I think up to that point, growing up in the Bible Belt, your parents kind of almost hold faith for you in some ways.
But what about being in Skid Row and in that whole environment? What made it come alive? Was it seeing God's grace in a difficult situation? Was it you stepping into the shoes, or was it seeing like redemptive stories? What about it was seeing is believing?
Well, I think part of it for me was the conviction of just how self-centered, self-focused I was.
Okay.
It's
more of an internal switch, being my life is not about me.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, I think that was a large part of it. But absolutely, I mean, there were incredible redemptive stories where you saw God miraculously bringing people out of drugs and alcohol, or up out of poverty, or just difficult situations. And so, the tendency in the world is to ask, where's God in the middle of those situations? But I think when you're truly in the middle of it, you see God all around you, and absolutely being downtown, being in Skid Row, you saw God there, even in the midst of all the pain and suffering.
So you're working for the church center, the Dream Center.
Volunteering
initially. Okay. Then it turns into work, or?
Yeah. So yeah, I just started volunteering, and eventually started a Bible study on site there at the Huntington. And eventually the doors just kind of opened up to come onto staff there. I actually thought I was going to have to go back to school because I felt, I began to feel this call in ministry. I did eventually get an architecture job, thank God. But just began to feel this call in ministry, even while I was doing architecture. And I'm like, I don't know how this is going to work out, but I just sensed this. And then I was approached by the church after I'd been there for 3 or 4 years, and the Bible study was doing really well, part of the life group ministry. And they had approached me saying, hey, the people that are leading the life groups at the church are going to be moving on. Would you prayerfully consider this? And, part-time ministry.
There's never a part-time church job.
Yeah. Part-time, huge pay cut.
Yeah.
Would you consider this? And I said, absolutely. And just knew it was a God thing. Yeah.
Amazing. So you were willing to take the risk. And then were you married then, or were you dating? You just still single?
Yep.
Okay. And then what made you start a church? From how long were you in that season? And then I know you were a church planner. What led to the church planning phase after that?
Yeah. So I was at the Dream Center for about 5 years, and did a number of things, obviously oversaw the life groups, did pastoral care, even oversaw the Adopt a Block for a while, a lot of outreach. So I can't speak enough to just how much I learned there and how much I grew there, grew in my faith, grew in ministry. Um, but I do think towards the end, there was this sense of just something missing for me.
Yeah.
How I did ministry, I felt like ministry at times was manipulation.
What's how so? Because that's an interesting point that I think enough people are not being honest about.
Yeah. Well, I mean, trying to get people into my ministry, trying to grow my ministry, trying to grow the numbers of
Yeah.
my ministry. And yeah, I began to realize like I manipulated people to really get them in and be a part. And I knew how to push people's buttons. I didn't major in it. I didn't study it, but like I picked up on it pretty quickly, kind of just the tendencies of other people in ministry as well. But like, hey, you can do this, and actually, people respond well to this. So I think there was a conviction in my own life and heart of this doesn't feel right.
Right.
Um, but I think too, just kind of being the personality that I was, I began to see things as well in the church that felt off. And yeah, this sense of wanting more authentic relationship within the church, and feeling like, there's a great article that Henry Nouwen wrote. It's about discipleship, and he talks about from solitude, community to ministry. And that was so impactful for me, and it really set me on a journey, because what I really realized is that rather than starting from solitude and really my relationship with God, so much of my faith started with ministry.
Mm-hmm.
And ministry really defined who I was. Ministry defined my relationship, and ministry defined how I related to others. I saw people through the lens of ministry rather than through the lens of my relationship with Christ.
Right.
If I'd seen them through my relationship with Christ, I would value them knowing that they're a brother and sister. When you see them through the lens of ministry, you see them as almost like, meat of like,
Right.
okay, somebody to help me build my ministry. So much in my own life, but just in ministry, seemed backwards and inauthentic. It felt like we got the cart before the horse.
Right.
And so
right.
I began this journey, even while I was still there at the Dream Center, of feeling like, I think there's
Something's
something
off.
more. Yeah, something's off. There's something more here.
Yeah, I had a light bulb moment like probably 6 years into preaching, because I the Lord called me to preach. So like I heard the Lord speak to me, go preach. So much of my identity was revolved around the being a preacher.
Yeah.
And then it got to a point where even something God tells you could be idolized or
Yeah.
bastardized, whatever word you want to use. And so much of my value was based on my preaching versus the gospel that I preach, and that I'm loved by God first and foremost, and then I'm a child of God first, and I happen to do a preaching act because out of obedience. And then just that simple difference of my values based on the gospel I preach versus being a preacher, and like that shift happening over the course of a year, it made me preach better. And if I preached a bad sermon or if there was no response, it didn't matter. It was an act of worship, and
That's right.
it was so freeing is the best way to describe it.
Yeah.
But that's really interesting. You saw that through the lens of numbers and trying to build your own ministry empire or whatever
Yeah.
in your life. Yeah. And then you decided, okay, I need to start my own church, or
Yeah. So we stepped down. At that point, I had gotten married. We'd been married about a year, and just it was God's timing to step down. And at that time, I started a business, which I still have to this day. I can talk more about, but
what's the business? Are you teaming up with your brother and building buildings, or
no, he's
Okay.
he's a pastor back in Iowa.
Oh, your brother's a pastor.
Yeah.
Oh, fascinating.
Yeah, so he's back in Iowa. That's a whole other story. But yeah, it was kind of a vein of architecture. I really enjoyed real estate. I enjoyed building. I enjoyed For me, like the biggest kick I get out of real estate development, construction, what I do, and I do some remodeling as well. It's just how to best utilize space.
Yeah.
Like I really enjoy that. So putting that to use, I started basically doing remodels. I had a business partner at the time, and man, that was just such a huge blessing. Because I didn't have I think I had $15,000 when my wife and I went off on our own. It was all in my retirement account, and so I don't recommend this, but I drained it and started a business with this partner of mine, and he really became the financier, where he just really loved on me. But he's like, hey, because I shared with him my idea amongst a few other people, and he's like, just know, like, I'm not investing in this business. I'm investing in you.
That's great.
And how many people get that,
Yeah.
with the amount of money that he put into our business, which I won't share, but just very impactful. And so I started that, real estate, really at the time, remodeling, flipping, if you want to call it business,
Were you doing this separately or while you were also trying to start a church?
same time.
Both same, so two
Yeah.
full-time jobs. Okay.
Yeah, that was a mistake. Mistake number one. Yeah, so I started the business. I also started the church. The whole idea behind the business was, how can I support myself?
Right.
So I'm not a drain on the church. Um, Later on that year, we would start the church, and so this was 2010, and yeah, had a group of friends that we were connected with, and I think any church planter, there's some level of dissatisfaction with the church as it is,
Right.
that really is some form of thrust to want to plant. And I think, church planters, there's a level of crazy there with all church planters.
Right. This is the entrepreneurial arm of
Yeah.
the church, and within that, you have the best and probably the craziest of some of the church leaders. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so yeah, I mean, there was a level of dissatisfaction that I was experiencing at that point in my life with the church. Like I'd said, I felt like there could be more. And launched out. Didn't know any better really at the time, and so yeah, we started the church, and it grew to about 40.
It's not bad.
Yep. And had a pretty vibrant community. But I think for us, I think it was probably about a year in where I began to realize, like, I something feels a little off here. And I think some of us had come out of like some church hurt, so I think that was part of it. But I think, like, even maturity wise, like I was 30 at the time, and the more I'm around pastors and planters, which I am a lot now, I really realize there's some validity to the immaturity that pastors have even at 30, and I find myself saying, like, wait, because I think for me there was immaturity. I think for our leadership team there was immaturity. I mean, I felt like my job towards the end a lot of the time was putting out fires, and that
Right.
wasn't even with the church. That was with the leaders.
Mm-hmm.
And so, yeah, the church grew to about 40, but after about a year, began to sense like something's a little off. And so by the second year, we made the decision to close it down, get people connected to different churches. But with that, the business just kept going, kept growing, and yeah, I think that really kind of eventually would bring a new chapter to ministry, what God was calling me to.
So describe that. So how long? What is this next chapter you're in?
Yeah, so we had moved on from the church, connected with just another church where honestly we were burned out. We needed to sit on the back row for a while, my wife and I. And so as the business continued to grow, we started with flips. Eventually, we were doing new construction builds, and just really saw God's hand upon the business. And yeah, I my intention coming away from the church plant was to pastor or plant again one day. Even though it didn't work out, like I loved it. I really enjoyed it. I wanted to do it again. I just realized I came away from the plant realizing like we rushed into things. We weren't ready yet. The vision was there, and it was a God ordained vision, but it wasn't the right time. And I think there are times in our life where that happens, where it's like God downloads, and yet we, at least kind of how I'm wired, it's like, all right, let's go do it.
Let's do
Let's
it
go
right
take
away.
the hill, And God's timing is not always that.
Like
So
King David was declared king, and then it took a while before he
exactly,
got there, and some really hard
yeah,
years in exile, being hunted down. Yeah,
yep, that's good. Yeah, so just being faithful, sitting on the back row, kind of healing. But yeah, during that time, the business just continued to grow. Started doing bigger and bigger projects, and a few years later, I just really began to get this sense of God not telling me, but asking me, like, what would it be like to really lay down that hope and dream of one day pastoring or planting again, and actually get behind other planters and pastors, and really strengthen and support them, and use the means that I've given you to actually bless them. And that really became the call for Manna, which is the ministry that we started in 2018. Just that we would be a wind to the back, that we would strengthen, encourage, resource um, local Southern California pastors, specifically pastors of churches that what I think we would refer to now are seedling churches, churches that are kind of in a rooting phase, whether they're a recent plant or maybe they're kind of in a fragile state, but just really encouraging, strengthening them, resourcing them, to really tell them like, hey, you're not alone.
yeah.
Keep going. We're here
And
for you.
it's not just financial resource here; it's also networking with. What else do you guys do? Because I think
Yeah.
this is the cool thing about what you're doing. You're networking. You're partnering with other organizations to create that resources to these church planners in Southern California. So what are the things that Manna offers?
Yeah, yeah. So we started out with grants. So we offer mercy and justice grants. So we give and we resource churches that are engaging their community, loving their community. We're not just going to give to like, hey, you want to put new carpet in your church? Here you go.
Yeah, some physical thing. Yeah,
Yeah. So we want to really give to churches that are taking ground. And so that's how we started. And every year we would do like 10 of them on average. Through the course of that, we just started building a relationship with these pastors where, I mean, it was no strings attached.
right.
That's this ministry. It's a grace ministry to pastors and churches. No strings attached. Hey, you get the grant, and at the end, we would have some times of equipping throughout the course of the year that they get the grant. But at the end of that year, it'd just be like, hey, this has been great, and we'll see you around. Let us know if you need anything. There was no string. There was no like, you got to be a part of
Yeah.
this. But through the course of that year, we would just build a relationship, and that was so fun. Like I would get, not that I drank coffee, but I would get to go and eat lunch or have a drink with these pastors and get to know their story and just build relationship. And once the year was up, a lot of times we found these pastors saying, you know what, this year having times of equipping, building relationship with you and some of the other members of the team, it's been phenomenal. We want to keep doing this. And so we just started building a relationship. Each year, alumni would come back and just it just continued to build. Um, and so it got to the point where it's like, maybe we ought to do some gatherings during the year just to get these pastors together, and maybe other pastors that similar minded, just want to come and have community with other like pastors and be encouraged. And so we started doing forums where we got together on a quarterly basis. And then eventually what you're referring to, just where in the last few years, so Manna is very much a mercy and justice ministry, but it's a mercy and justice ministry to the church. So our intent is not to really directly sow into the community. We sow into the church. We believe the church is the vehicle. Christ established the church. And so we're all about sowing into the church and then seeing the church sow into the community. And so, as a mercy and justice ministry, we felt like, I think we've got the mercy thing down pretty well, like caring and concern for the church, the local church. But what does it mean to have justice? What does it mean to be just? And I think within the church, oftentimes we don't want to talk about that. Justice is a hot button topic culturally, but I think even the last few years have exposed within the church that it's a hot button issue too. But we've embraced that, and so we really.
So let's unpack
Yeah.
the word justice. Is it a reference to social justice? Is it a reference to just truth? What do you mean by justice?
So how we define it is the flourishing of all.
Okay.
And so that means that as we resource these churches, they're engaged in mercy and justice, in their communities. Mercy, listening, caring, loving, supporting, strengthening, even resourcing. That's mercy. Those are all merciful things. Justice means, are you concerned with the community, with the city, with the flourishing of those people in your community, the people that God's called you to reach out to? And so the church is called to that. We're called to serve the church. As a mercy and justice ministry, I think we had the mercy thing down. We were giving grants, and we were supporting and strengthening, but we really began to ask the question of like, hey, we're encouraging these churches to be full of mercy and justice. What does it mean for us as an organization to be full of justice? Yeah. And that's where we really kind of got into, and I think it really kind of brought it full circle for me, because if as the church, as a ministry, if we're for the flourishing of all churches, are we truly for the flourishing of all churches? And I think the answer to that for a lot of churches is no, unfortunately.
Yeah, I feel that more so, especially here in Southern California.
Mm-hmm.
But I do love this aspect of, Jesus came full of grace and truth.
Mm-hmm.
It's a both and, not a either or.
Yeah.
And I do love that desire for impact because it's important, because if you invest in a secular company, you want to see results, you want to see action, you want to see some tangible value.
Yeah.
Yet sometimes when maybe church organizations, they could just not require that.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, there's this illustration, with when you do street ministry, there's a point at which mercy actually can become detrimental.
Mm-hmm.
Like, for instance, if there's someone on the street, a homeless person, and you every week just keep bringing them food, eventually you're not actually helping them. You're actually hurting them.
Right.
And that's where justice comes in. Justice says, this person is equal to me. If this person is equal to me, then how can I help them have dignity? If they're created in the image of God, how can I help them have dignity, love, family, community? It's not just saying, hey, here's some food and be blessed, but it's actually like, do I see this person truly as an equal? Because if I do, it's not just a one point of contact, it becomes multiple points of contact. And I think that's where mercy needs justice and justice needs mercy.
Right. They go hand in hand.
Absolutely.
That's well put. That's great to hear.
Yep.
So it's very cool to see how God utilizes all your giftings and your backgrounds. Like, I feel like sometimes people have to have this either or. God's calling me to ministry, but I also have this other passion of architecture. But it doesn't have to be an either or. It could be both and. I could do my job and I could also do ministry at the same time.
Yep.
And I love the purity of your heart, by the way, and how you're creating these checks and balances of making sure I'm doing these for the right motive. I'm not going to be compromised by the paycheck. I'm going to work. I'm going to make sure there's mercy and justice. And I think that's really powerful and potent. And then on top of it, just altruistically serving the leaders or the churches to serve the community is so freeing and wonderful to see that unfold. And it's only been a few years now, right? Manna has been around since 2018, you said?
Yeah. So this is, year 7. Yeah, and I think with the justice component and what that calls us to, just kind of finishing that up, is that if it's not only mercy and justice amongst people, but it's also mercy and justice amongst the church.
Yeah.
So that means that, and Paul alludes to this in 2 Corinthians 8, where he uses manna as an illustration, but he's talking to the church at Corinth, and he's encouraging them, imploring them to, hey, come through on your gift to the church in Jerusalem, the church that was poor. And he says that in fairness, he talks about fairness amongst the church, that just like the children of Israel, that some had too much, some had too little, and yet they all had enough. And so he was using that illustration of manna.
That's where the name comes from?
That's where the name came from. But just this illustration of like that all churches would have enough. And he's very clear about that in the name of fairness, in the name of equality, that churches would have enough. And so I think manna has really embraced that. And I think as we began to diagnose that, we said, look, mercy's great, and we want to continue to give these churches. But again, just like the person on the street, if all we do is just give to churches, give and give, then it actually can become detrimental. And so what does justice call us to? Well, it calls us to sustainability, because we want to see these churches have dignity. We want to see them grow. We want to see them have longevity. We want to even see these pastors have health.
Yeah, and from my experience with the organization, that word sustainability is used quite frequently on all fronts, and it's beautiful because it creates that transformation, not just a handout.
Yeah, that's right.
It's great. I remember when I took a course at the Woodrow Wilson School in Princeton, and it was about nonprofits. And for our actual class, we were given, I believe it was $100,000. They just gave us actual money, a nonprofit, to just, here's your money, figure out how to give it away. So there was like the best and brightest individuals like trying to figure out how are we going to donate this money. And it was interesting. One of the findings of many was typically the most popular one or the trendy one usually gets all the funding. But there's always these like B plus or B organizations that are always struggling with the income. And there was a conclusion like, okay, maybe we'll have more of a bigger impact by supporting the Bs instead of going to the conventional A church or A organization. And we just ended up giving, we split up the grants to a group of B organizations in New Jersey for at-risk youth.
That's good.
But it was just an interesting, just a mind bend of, okay, we have these resources. How are we going to resource maximum impact? It was just an interesting case study. But I do feel like there's a lot of great churches that maybe get all the attention, but there's so many like amazing on the ground churches that need that support and that equality.
Yep, that's right.
But yeah, it's amazing work you're doing. Anything else you want to promote for Manna or as we wrap up?
Yeah. No, I mean, even that being said, I think the big church needs the small church or the seedling church, and the seedling church needs the big church, and so I think for us, it's not an us or them or anything like that. I think it's definitely a working together, but there are very few organizations kind of creating awareness for that seedling church, and that's what we're all about. And I think it's the next gen church too. A lot of these churches are younger leaders.
And they all are fed up with. They want that authenticity, like the frustrations that. Yeah, I think it's across the board now.
Yeah. So I think, man, to begin seeing, some of these churches work together, the big and the small, it's beautiful to see some of these big churches like mentor some of the younger churches, but then to see like the energy and the vibrance where some of these pastors and more established churches say, man, I got to go and see them do church. Like one of the churches we minister to, they literally, their church is meeting at a homeless shelter. That's where they do church. And to hear like a well-established pastor say, I went to that church and I experienced it and I learned stuff that, just blew my mind.
Yeah.
So to see kind of the back and forth
right
of the capital C church working together is beautiful.
Any success stories you want to share? Something really cool you're proud of that you've seen? You have quite a few.
Yeah. I think, hearing, for me, what gets me the most is when I hear pastors say, honestly, I wanted to quit. And then you guys came along and you encouraged me.
Wow.
And I'm back in the fight basically. Like when I hear stories like that, like it just like
Right, right.
gets me going.
And you know what it feels like being in that on the other end of that.
Absolutely.
That's amazing
That's
work.
very full circle for me. Yeah.
Very cool. Final question. If you had one message to share with the church, what would it be?
Boy, there's a lot of messages I would share. But if I had one, um, I would say actually that we as the church we need to embrace the mercy and the justice. We need to embrace even those hot button issues because ultimately, when you look at Jesus's ministry and when you look at the ministry of the church, it's within the pain, within the suffering where ministry happens. That's always where ministry happens. It's not, where things are all good and glory and all that. It's in the pain and the suffering. And so I think as the church, if we can really embrace that, if we can have honest discussions about that, if we can come together in unity, then I think that the world will take notice. I think, unfortunately, the world took notice that during COVID, especially, like the church is no different than the world. And we saw the church in many ways kind of fall apart. I know it's kind of built itself back up, but I actually think that we need to fully embrace the ugliness and the pain and the suffering and some of those difficult issues, the mercy and justice even within the church. And I think if we do, man, we're just going to see a beautiful church. It's not going to be pretty, but it's what we're called to. It's what the gospel calls us to. So, yeah, small church, large church, it's all part of God's church. Mercy, justice, we're called to be that amongst each other. And so, absolutely, I would just encourage the church in that.
Thank you, James.
Yeah, my pleasure.
Thank you, everyone, for tuning in to the end of this Christ and Coffee podcast. Have a blessed week, and remember to stay caffeinated, my friends. God bless you.